Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. British politics, eh? Where to begin? Where to begin? This is, I mean, we've got a kind of, the title is slightly light-hearted, tractor porn. But this is a serious issue. We're talking about, of course, misogyny, Thursday in politics. We're going to be talking about the sex industry later. Now, all of this has been kicked off originally, this particular, I suppose, episode, by just a crude misogynistic attack on Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, basically suggesting there was this attempt, a fatal attraction attempt to distract Boris Johnson. It was a really, by the way, not just a really misogynistic piece in the Mail on Sunday, which is where it appeared last week, also profoundly classist, suggesting Angela Rayner, who grew up around the corner from me in Stockport, funny enough, she always says I'm from the posh part of the street, but where it said like she doesn't have the same talents as Boris Johnson in the Oxford Union as a debater, and therefore she has to rely on, well, her sexual prowess as a woman. Profoundly classist and misogynistic. And what this did is open up a discussion where many women in politics and in the media, and the kind of media political ecosystem, of course, are very much intertwined, spoke about their own experiences of misogyny, of within the political world and within the media industry. And then this escalated where a Conservative MP was firstly not identified, which I'll come on to, but a Tory MP who had watched pornography in the House of Commons in front of his colleagues. Let's just have a little, just to so aware just how ludicrous and outrageous this is. This MP was Neil Parish, and he was interviewed on GB News about the Tory MP before he'd been identified, which was him. Just take a look at this.
And just very finally, Neil, while we've got you on these reports, and we know your chief whip is looking into them from a female minister about another Conservative frontbencher watching pornography on his phone. What's your reaction to that? I mean, it's pretty jaw-dropping, the suggestion that it's happened. I mean, frankly, whoever it is, I mean, surely they would have to have the whip removed, wouldn't they?
I mean, I think the Whip's office will do a thorough investigation, and we will wait and see that result. And I think, from that, then the decision will have to be made what action to be taken.
Is there a problem?
I mean, that was him. He's talking about himself there. He's the MP. That's so Neil Parish was then identified and then tearfully resigned. Let's just have a look at how he explained his actions watching pornography in the House of Commons.
So is your decision based on an acknowledgement of wrongdoing?
Yes, and I'll explain to you exactly what it is.
Okay.
The situation was that funnily enough, it was tractors that I was looking at, and so I did get into another website that had a sort of very similar name, and I watched it for a bit, which I shouldn't have done.
Sorry, I just let that settle in for a minute. He was looking at tractors and then ended up watching pornography. Sure, cool. Obvious segue. I did try and investigate myself, not too thoroughly, about how exactly that link could have been made using Google. It's still not entirely clear to me, I'll be honest with you, but maybe someone else can shed some light on this. So I suppose the issue here is whatever we think about pornography, and we're going to talk to a brilliant sex worker shortly about that, because I think it's really important that those are the voices at the fore in this discussion. There is a difference between men consuming pornography privately and doing so publicly in front of other women, which many would consider to be akin, well, it's sexual harassment or even essentially veering towards flashing. So this is a conversation about misogyny, which has been opened up by these two big incidents, I suppose. Now, before we bring in our first brilliant guest, who we're very lucky to have, I should also explain later on we'll be talking to Professor Paul Rogers, who we've been very, very lucky to have on the show several times. Of course, the Professor of Peace Studies, someone who, when I was a student, I studied his work, had a big impact on me. So it's a big honor to have him able to talk to us about what's happening in Ukraine. And I just want the latest on that. What's the situation in Ukraine at the moment? Is it a stalemate? Is Russia losing? Is that essentially what's happening? What's going on now? Russian forces have concentrated their forces on the Donbass region. Obviously, originally they wanted a lightning strike on Kyiv, the capital, to take the government down and potentially occupy the whole country and impose a puppet regime. That didn't work. So now instead they're amassing their forces and focusing them on the eastern region. But it doesn't look like they're making good progress there either. So it'd be interesting to see exactly what's happening. Also, there's some, I mean, we don't just throw nuclear war around willy-nilly, but Russia is a nuclear armed power. The West are nuclear armed powers. We do need to talk about that as well, and the potential threat of an escalation. So we are going to talk about that. Just as ever, if you're watching live, click on the YouTube link, press like and subscribe. You can support the channel and the podcast and all the videos that we do and the documentaries by going to patreon.com/OwenJones84. We're getting the channel up and running again properly after not a hiatus, but we've kept it kind of ticking, but I've had to do my book. But we've got some great interviews coming up, including Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, and Peter Hitchens. Of course, we always promised we'd speak to people from across the political spectrum. So we've got those 3 interviews coming up. If you want to put questions to them in advance, if you go to patreon.com/OwenJones84, I've done a post where people can submit their questions to all of them, and also to suggest other people that we should approach and speak to, and the next documentaries that we should do. So that'd be great. Do that. Also, of course, the podcast. Look up the podcast. Many of you are listening to it on the podcast right now. But do leave a review if you can and spread the word. That's enough for me. Oh, quickly, if you want to also put questions to the guests and support them, use Super Chat. I will thank everybody at the end of the show. Let's bring in the brilliant councillor, Shaista Aziz, who is also, just so many you've got many hats, I would say, but also a extremely courageous campaigner against male violence against women. And someone I've actually worked with alongside when we together, along with a big team, helped organise the national protests against Donald Trump's visit, and Shaista played a pivotal role in that. So, as I've said, many roles. How you doing?
Hi, Owen. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a while, as I've said. I've not seen you IRL for a fair whack. Yeah, I want to talk firstly. Okay, what do you think these two episodes that I've just referred to, Angela Rayner and Neil Parish, what do they tell us about misogyny in British politics? What's the kind of general overview that you've got?
Well, I think these 2 instances tell us again that misogyny is thriving alive and well in this country, as it is in many parts of the world. In your introduction, you mentioned Donald Trump, a hardcore misogynist. I think it's really important for us to understand that what happens in politics is mirroring what is happening in real life. And there will be lots of people who, when they came across this horrific story, not only the attacks against Angela Rayner, which are beyond outrageous, but then this incident of the Tory MP choosing to watch pornography in his place of work, the House of Commons. I'm sorry to say, Owen, it doesn't come as a complete surprise or a shock to anyone who's paying attention to what's going on in relation to misogyny and how it's been mainstreamed over many decades. But if we just look at the last few years, for example, we just look at what's happening with the pandemic. We've had record numbers of cases of domestic abuse, for example, being reported to police during lockdowns. Throughout lockdowns across the world, in countries like Spain, in Colombia and other parts of the world, the UN has gone on record to say that there has been a parallel pandemic in relation to violence against women and girls. Here in our own country, we've seen high-profile murder, tragic murders of young women, and we've seen the response from the police to women campaigners, attacking them, minimizing them. But if we go back to Parliament, I mean, as a woman in politics, I have to tell you, and as a minoritized woman, a visible Muslim woman, a brown woman, it's not an easy place to be. I think misogyny doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there will be plenty of men out there who believe they're allies of women who might sort of be surprised at this. Well, I'd sort of say to them, and indeed everyone, there's nothing to be surprised about. You can only be surprised if you're not paying attention. I think it's really important that there's been a level of pushback that we've seen from across the political spectrum in relation to this. But we have to ask ourselves why this MP thought it was okay to be watching pornography, not in Parliament. Why he thought he was going to get away with that.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of, just mentioned there, in terms of women in politics, I mean, there's been some progress, particularly, I suppose, in the Labour Party, actually, in fairness to it, in that there are now, before 1997, only 10% of MPs were women, which is an astonishingly low figure. And there's been substantial progress, particularly amongst the Parliamentary Labour Party, but women are still a minority in Parliament. And obviously, there's local government. Of course, you're a politician in local government as well. What are the kind of obstacles that exist at any level, I suppose, of politics in terms of women coming forward, putting themselves forward? I mean, one of the things people may be aware of all women shortlists introduced in the Labour Party was the basis for that was without them, you still get, because people are like, oh, that's, imposing this kind of artificial kind of means to get, rather than the best possible candidate, but actually otherwise you get selection by prejudice because people have a view of what a politician is, and it's often framed as a white middle-class man. So what's your thoughts just in terms of those obstacles that women face in politics and the attitudes from men, which form a formidable block often?
Yeah. So I think you're right to point out the Labour Party has made a lot of progress. Obviously, the red herring is we've never had a woman leader, and I do hope that changes soon. We do obviously have women in senior positions in the shadow cabinet, which is important. But yeah, there are multiple challenges because, well, the main one is patriarchy, and patriarchy impacts women, it impacts men, it impacts people. I think some of the main challenges really are, this whole notion of what is a woman's role, what is a man's role. If women are doing well, often they are accused, as Angela Rayner has been, of using her sexuality, of using her looks, for example, to get ahead. But there's multiple challenges. We know that the data shows that women have to be asked multiple times before they agree to stand in a political position. We also know that the toxicity out there is absolutely rife. I mean, I can tell you, Owen, that in the last 4 years, I've been subjected to really grim levels of racism and misogyny, trolling. Every time I'm on television, for example, overwhelmingly it's men who are tweeting me, attacking me. And the kind of nonsense I get is I'm frequently asked if I'm a spokesperson for the Taliban or ISIS, based purely on the fact that I'm a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, nothing else. There's many challenges. I think there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in politics, but I think it's also really important for us to, discuss the fact that women are the custodians of patriarchy as much as men can be as well. What I've been really impressed by in relation to this horrific attacks against Angela Rayner and also this MP is that, across this political spectrum, there's been a lot of unity and people have come together, men and women, to call this out. And I think that's exactly what should happen. But there are multiple challenges. But at the same time, what I would like to emphasize as well is that record numbers of women are putting themselves forward here in our country and indeed across the world to be selected and to be elected. And I think that's brilliant. In France, we've seen what's happened with Le Pen, absolutely horrific. But recently I was speaking to a French Muslim woman who is putting herself forward to be elected in the forthcoming local elections there. And I think that's brilliant. And that's only happening because solidarity is being built. So the Labour Women's Network, the Fabian Women's Network, I was vice chair there for a number of years. We've all been working collectively with a number of other organisations to support and show solidarity to women. And I'd like to be really clear, I'm including trans women in this as well.
Oh, great. I mean, I was going to say, actually, just in terms of, I suppose, intersectionality was a word I was going to throw in there. And that's what you've spoken through, you've woven that through that answer. And particularly, as the specific the racism, misogyny that women of colour get and how that intersects. So just tell me a bit more about how important that is, that issue of intersectionality. If we talk about women's representation in politics, how intersectionality has to be at the absolute core of that.
Well, it has to be front and center of everything. So, I get a little bit bored and tired when women like to talk about women in politics, but they're not really looking around the table to see which women are excluded. If we're only seeing a particular type of women, so if it's only straight white women from a particular class, then that's frankly not progress, is it? Diane Abbott, as we know, is the main woman in politics who is subjected to the highest level of misogyny and racism. There's plenty of data out there and research that's shown that is the case. And I find that Diane Abbott still doesn't get the level of solidarity that she should get from all women in politics and indeed women in society. And, she is definitely a target and a victim of misogyny and racism. And misogyny, racism, classism, ableism, they always collide. And we've seen that in the case of Angela Rayner, the fact that she is of working class heritage, the fact that she didn't go to Oxford. I mean, I'm from Oxford. I'm talking to you from the city of Oxford. Believe me, I understand the ins and outs of the power dynamics of Oxford more than the average person does. It's just grotesque and horrific. But if we are to actually make progress, and if we are to fix our democracy, which, let's be honest, it's in peril, quite frankly, then we have to put intersectionality at the heart of everything, starting with our politics and our democracy. And for some people, they think this is sort of like a woke term. Well, it's not. We need to see representation. Representation matters, and we will only get a better democracy if it is representative of the people.
I was just going to say, finally, on that, what are the kind of, for you, what has to change? What are the kind of practical things that need to change to combat misogyny in politics and to get the sort of women's representation that you're talking about at all levels?
Well, first of all, Owen, we need to see accountability. We need to understand why, Angela Rayner has been under attack. We have to understand, why there's been a lack of accountability. So the Me Too movement has resurged, as we know, in the last few years. And we know Westminster, there's been plenty of investigations in relation to the cultures in there that allow misogyny to thrive. But it's not just Westminster, is it? So I think practical terms, what we need to see is anybody involved in politics pledging to stamp out misogyny. And frankly, if we're going to stamp out misogyny, we're more likely to stamp out transphobia, homophobia, and racism, because they always connect. If we can't look at systems of oppression just as singular, systems, they always intersect. So what I would like to see is more mentoring programs for everyone, but particularly minoritized women. We need to see greater solidarity across the political spectrum, and we need to see men in particular, powerful men in politics, calling this out, not trying to make excuses, not trying to suggest that things like this should be brushed under the carpet. I mean, I think the attacks against Angela Rayner in the last few weeks, last few days, I should say, by powerful newspapers in this country are utterly disgraceful. And what kind of message does it send to young women who are reading those headlines and looking at what's going on? It's very clear. It basically says this is not for you. Stay away. You should not be involved in politics. And what me and other people and campaigners and activists and organizations are saying is the exact opposite. We need to see our democracy is basically at stake. We need to see a far more representative democracy. We need everyone to pull together. We need to call this out, and we need to not be afraid of calling it out either.
Shaista, as eloquent and powerful as ever. Really, really appreciate your wisdom and your insight. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Owen.
See you in a bit. Lots of love.
Take care.
So really eloquent kind of exposition of misogyny in British politics. Now, obviously, Tory MP watching porn in the House of Commons. I think a really important discussion needs to be had about the industry itself and the people who work in the industry. And with that in mind, we have the brilliant Ivy Maddox. Now, this is unconventional, but it's kind of fun. Ivy's joining us just by audio. If you're listening to the podcast, you don't know what I'm talking about. But basically, it's just me talking to Ivy, who is visually not with us, but very much audibly with us. Hey, Ivy, how you doing? How you doing? Yeah,
I'm
can
good,
hear
thank you.
very clearly.
So it's not uncommon for sex workers to not be face out. However, I am actually face out. I just didn't realise this was a video call. So normally I wouldn't mind, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry, a terrible failure of communication on my part, but it doesn't matter because we've got you here and we can hear you, and that's all that matters. And it gives a bit of mystique, a bit of mystery, which I like. So
well, yeah, well they'll have to follow the Twitter link or something on your shout out to find out what it looked like.
Exactly. So it's a real mystery to everyone. Okay, let's just start with this. Tory MP watching porn, not privately, which, let's be honest, the vast majority of men have done. That's what all the research shows. He's watching it in the House of Commons on the parliamentary benches with women around. What would you say in terms of that? People say that's just so unacceptable.
Well, I mean, this is not the first MP to have been caught enjoying the labour of sex workers, Damien Green. I mean, full service sex workers have seen city MPs in real life, and they're consuming porn and sex work with absolutely no care for the people involved. So yeah, it's not okay to watch porn at work, but that could be said about anyone. So yeah.
Now, let's just talk about yourself as someone who works in the industry? Because obviously what happens is you get occasionally these kind of flashpoints and then everyone talks about porn. And it might, I just wonder how frustrating that is for you, the kind of conversation, the kind of talking points that come up. So what's your general take on this whole debate? Suddenly everyone's talking about porn in media, in politics. As a sex worker, what, in terms of how much it accords with your experience, that whole debate, what's your take on it?
Well, people are quick to wank with one hand and point with the other, aren't they? Everyone is happy to consume the porn, but also make the lives of the people in the industry worse by then consuming stolen porn because of all these tube sites, right? And then for those people that don't like porn or hate porn, abolition is never going to work either, because as long as people have cameras and genitals, it's going to happen. So this is the discussion that so often seems to be happening over our heads. And people talk about going into the sex industry, right? To unionize and come in and save us. But actually there is loads happening behind the scenes. We don't need rescuing. We just need people to be more on board with us organising, because that's what's happening in the sex industry already. And obviously we're the best placed people to understand what's happening in our industry and change it.
Now, there's a big debate within feminism about sex work, the nature of sex work. And some feminists would very much take the argument, there's this idea that sex work is presented as empowering, and they would say it very much isn't. It's profoundly exploitative, innately so. So what's your take on that, when that whole argument?
Oh, this is another really boring one. So how many people find their job empowering? Nearly every job under capitalism is just humiliating yourself under the threat of starvation, right? So that's my answer for that.
So
you have good days and you have bad days, right?
So your point there would be it is innately exploitative, but all labour, wage labour under capitalism is exploitative.
Of course. Do you think I would I would love to be sitting on a yacht right now and not ever having to worry about money for the rest of my life, but I've got to eat, right? And I've worked in an office before, but I found that way more humiliating, and I'd much rather have a dick in my mouth.
Now, in terms of we're talking straight porn is what I suppose the conversation's about, because I tweeted about this the other day and people are like, oh, what are you trying to say? Gay porn's fine, are you? I just think it's a separate conversation. It's a separate conversation because, a lot of people would say, often hypocritically because they're watching it, but that straight porn, it reflects and reinforces profoundly misogynistic attitudes towards women. It often is, very much about kind of domination in a kind of the man being often quite aggressive. What's your take on that kind of straight porn and misogyny?
Okay, so obviously, there's loads of different porn out there. There's not just the male being dominated, but yes, I agree. Straight porn is inherently misogynistic because straight relationships are inherently misogynistic. Because we live in the patriarchy, there is absolutely nothing free of the patriarchy or misogynism. So if people want more feminist porn, then they should stop pirating it. The reason why most porn is made by gross straight men is because the people who are making the most money right now are straight men. So yeah.
In terms of the conditions, we talked about this, just again, work and the innately kind of exploitative nature of all wage labour. But what are the kind of conditions that you would particularly want to highlight within the industry? Obviously they vary, but the kind of what needs to change above all else in your view?
Okay, so I'm quite aware that I seem like I'm moaning about my job here as well, which I'm not. I really enjoy my job. It suits me for my life and how I like to live. But there are some things that could change. There are some things that are really good. There are also things that can change, like paperwork that could clearly identify performers' consent boundaries, as well as verbal, which is what it is at the moment, and they could be actions as well as no words, so it doesn't interrupt the scene. I think the presence of security cameras as a record of professional conduct for all parties, that is a good idea, and more people are doing that these days. And also one really exciting thing that's happening a lot more is the use of intimacy coordinators. So these are people who check the consent boundaries and not cross during filming, and they speak on victim witness in court, and they're like a third party, so they're independently funded. We already have these in films and TV, and they like make sure like the actors are okay, and it feels like you can speak to them confidently without, you know, having to worry about like, oh, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to piss off my boss. But yeah, more of those important. It would be nice to see.
Finally, decriminalization. Finally, just final thing, decriminalization. Now, obviously, that we're not talking so much. That's not porn in the same way. They're obviously sex workers often work in different aspects of the industry, not just one. So, what's your take on that about, you know, decriminalization, which at the moment, again, in politics, is just not even on the agenda. The Tories obviously wouldn't go there. Labour, certainly its current incarnation, would never even think about decriminalisation. But again, a debate within feminism, and one wing of feminism would again make the argument that decriminalisation would just means basically decriminalise. I mean, I know you've kind of alluded to this, but degrading and an innately misogynistic treatment of women. So what's your take on decriminalisation and the arguments for, and how close the prospect of decriminalisation is?
Okay, so decriminalisation shifts the power back into the hands of the workers, which is what we want, right? We've seen in New Zealand already that they actually have, they're under decrim, and we saw that people felt safer at work. People are able to turn down clients, and there are generally safer workplaces because the brothels are more regulated and they just look after the workers better. At the moment here, people are talking about the Nordic model, which is which would be really harmful, because at the moment, you know, we can screen people, they give over their ID and things like that, and but if the clients were going to be criminalized, then they are a lot less likely to be able to want to give over their ID. And also maybe like the good clients, inverted commas, might, you know, leave. They might be like, actually, this isn't a risk I'm willing to take. But the bad guys, you know, they're still going to take that risk because they don't care so much, right? And that we're going to be left with not as much work and having to take more risks, and it's just being more unsafe for us. So decriminalization is so important because, yeah, it's about our safety, and it's about giving us more power, and yeah, that's what we want, basically.
Ivy, it's been such an honour, honestly, real pleasure. Really, we can't see you, but we can hear your huge eloquence through your answers. So that's great. That's all we needed.
Oh,
We needed your voice.
you.
So honestly, it was such an honor, especially at short notice. And again, sorry we didn't explain to Ivy properly that this is it's a video as well as an audio.
You
channel.
can see me on my Twitter, but you know, content warning, like I do like anal gangbangs. So
Great to know. But this is a very show. I like the fact we're just touching on all the big issues. Just finally, sorry, David Barata asks, what are your thoughts on the decentralization of adult content, with more people creating adult content independently with like OnlyFans? Just quickly, do you have any views?
Was this me? Were you
Yeah, is that just you? Yeah, just finally,
okay.
just someone sent that in. Just wondered what your thoughts were.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So this is really good. It gives power back to the worker. However, there's the online harms bill proposal, which is going to be really bad for those people. It's going to be bad for everyone that produces their own porn or advertises online for escorting. It basically will it'll kind of look like the American legislation Foster-Sester, where it's illegal to advertise those things and also illegal to put out adult content. So yeah, everything like banning something won't make it go away. It will just go onto the dark web, and it'll less regulation and more harm to the people that are involved in it.
Supermark says, wish Ivy was in charge of things.
Oh, thanks, babe. Well, you can come and have a session. I'll be in charge of you.
Oh, Oh, it's happy Sunday, everyone. Honestly, Ivy, it's been a real pleasure. Seriously, thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. But honestly, it was great having you. Really brilliant stuff.
Thanks, bye. Bye.
Take care now. Bye. Right. Well, now I like do a quick segue away from that. From sex work. No. We're now obviously going to talk about the continuing horrific war, of course, in Ukraine following Russia's invasion of the country. This is a war, obviously, which has been going on now for many weeks with terrible human consequences. Most notoriously, of course, the city of Mariupol reduced to rubble. We've seen, of course, the terrible massacres that took place in Bucha, and we've seen across Ukraine bombings and people being murdered by Putin's invading army. Now, before we just bring in our brilliant guest, of course, Professor Paul Rogers, he barely needs an introduction, but I will give him one anyway shortly. Let's just hear, just one of the things we'll talk about is the issue of tensions between the West and Russia. They are, of course, nuclear armed blocs. Now, the Foreign Minister, Lavrov, this is what he said. Let's just have a little hit. I mean, some people might go, oh, why are you going to put on Russian propaganda? I think we need to hear, obviously, what's been said, and we can then contextualize it. So let's just hear what he said.
We don't consider ourselves at war with NATO. Unfortunately, NATO, it seems, considers itself to be at war with Russia. NATO and European Union leaders, many of them in England, in the United States, Poland, France, Germany, and of course, European Union chief diplomat Josep Borrell, they bluntly, publicly, and persistently say, Putin must fail, Russia must be defeated. When you use this terminology, I believe you think that you are at war with the person whom you want to be defeated.
Let's begin now. Professor Paul Rogers, who is, of course, Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. It's great to have you, Paul. How are you doing?
Hello, good to be back.
Great to see you. Okay, firstly, this war originally, I mean, they didn't say this was their intention, but I think it's legitimate and reasonable to say that they wanted a lightning strike on Kyiv and to take down the government and install a puppet government. I think that was their war aim, wasn't it? And now what they've done is they've refocused on the east, the Donbass region. Why has this war gone on for so long when Russia is obviously a much bigger and has a much supposedly bigger and more sophisticated military than that of Ukraine? What has happened?
I think that there are several different reasons in many ways. One is that at the start, I agree with you fully, that what Putin and the Kremlin were expecting was to be able to basically take Kyiv probably within the first 36 hours or so, to, well, basically remove the Ukraine government, the elected government, and replace it with a regime which many people would see as a puppet regime. At that time, they also wanted to do two other things, very importantly. One was to take air supremacy, control of the airspace within Ukraine, total control, because that would make it much easier for them to move around on the ground. And thirdly, they clearly wanted to extend the influence and in parts the control that they had in Crimea through to the Donetsk region, which is basically the eastern part of Ukraine, including two areas that have basically declared themselves as independent and have been recognized by Russia just before the start of the war. So that was what they wanted. It went wrong right from the start. They failed on Kyiv. In many ways, the Ukrainians were ready for the initial air assault. And as a result, within sort of 36 hours, it was clear that things weren't going quite right. And if that started on the Thursday, remember it was on the Sunday that you had a clearly frustrated, angry Putin saying NATO keep out of this because otherwise we risk an escalation to something worse. In other words, he was threatening some sort of nuclear retaliation at that time. Now, that, of course, has not come. But what has developed since, I absolutely agree with you, is that Russia's tended to concentrate on the south and east. It's actually withdrawn its troops. It did it about 4 weeks ago from a very substantial area in the north, including all the way around Kyiv. And that has basically given rise to much more evidence about the crimes, the atrocities, the war crimes and the rest that have been going on. So now I think what Russia is doing, or the Kremlin is doing, must always use that term because it does not represent all Russians by a very long shot, either abroad or within Russia. But the point is that what Putin and the Kremlin are now doing is trying to consolidate the degree of rather limited progress they've had in the East and to some extent in the South. But even there, it's proved problematic because essentially, why has it gone wrong for them? Well, essentially, I think there are probably three different reasons. One is the Ukrainians obviously have proved to be far more determined to resist, both at a societal level and at a military level as well, far more than the Russians expected. And this is a huge miscalculation on the side of the Putin people. They expected it to be something of a walkover. What they expected was to take control of Ukraine, like the huge influence they have in Belarusia, and the two together would effectively extend Kremlin influence several hundred kilometers to the west, much more fully onto the border with NATO, although obviously Belarusia, a much smaller country in population, already has a border with NATO. So that was what they wanted. That is not what they've got. And consolidation, I think, is back to the east and also to the south. But there are other reasons as well. One was that essentially the Russian armed forces proved far less effective and efficient than people expected. We could talk about this a lot, but the bottom line is that they were nothing like as good as the Russians expected, or even the Western analysts expected, because most Western analysts on the official line in the United States and in Britain and NATO expected the Ukrainians to lose within at most 2 to 3 weeks, and possibly even less than that. But then the final issue, I think, is in many ways the question of what is happening within Russia. Because, of course, although we're seeing a lot of the effect of the sanctions and the rest, what we're perhaps not seeing is the high level of casualties that are being experienced by the Russian army. And these have been quite extraordinary. I mean, it's probably reasonably accurate, take aside all the exaggerations on both sides, that the Russian army, primarily the army and inclusive navy on the ship, the Moskva, they've probably lost about 15,000 young men killed. And that means, in the type of war that's going on, at least 30,000 so badly injured that they're out of combat, maybe for a long time, many of them maimed for life. Now, that is a huge total. I mean, the 15,000 they've lost in, what is it, about 9 weeks, is about similar, it's even more than the Russian losses in 10 years of the war in Afghanistan. So that gives you some idea of that. And it's one of the big unknowns about whether that ultimately will actually have an impact on the ability of the Kremlin to wage war. We're not seeing that yet, but we certainly saw that earlier on in some ways. But I think the other thing that I missed out in that catalogue was the amount of support that had come from NATO at a very early stage. And essentially that is now huge. It's reckoned about 10 very heavily laden large military transport aircraft are flying into bases in Romania and Poland and probably one or two of the other states neighboring Russia, bringing all kinds of armaments, and they're getting increasingly modern and increasingly, if you like, offensive, ones that can go over a long range. So that's the really problem from Putin's point of view. He's also achieved a degree of unity in NATO, which wasn't expected, and a degree of unity in the EU. So overall, he is in a difficult position, but from his own perspective, not least ideology, he is absolutely determined to continue. And this is where you get the likes of Sergei Lavrov basically threatening the risk, just the risk of escalation to something far worse, which means we are in an era, I would categorize it as essentially violent stalemate or unstable stalemate. It is becoming increasingly not just a state on state, but also a proxy war, and there's no easy end in sight. And the problem is of a risk of escalation at some stage. I think we're in the most dangerous stage in the war, although it doesn't seem like that now, any time in the last 2 or so months, I'm afraid.
I mean, before I just ask you a bit further about that, so kind of an alarming final sentence, I have to say. They've obviously now reconsolidated their forces in the east, in Donbass, which, I mean, I suppose is the justification, the rationale they tried to provide for the war, which was there's a large ethnic Russian population in that country, though by no means even before the Russian invasion did that mean they were necessarily pro-Kremlin, for example, but that they were being oppressed by the Kyiv government. But it doesn't look like it's going well for Russia there either, even though they've consolidated their forces in that particular area, which is obviously a less ambitious mission than that they originally planned. But the progress is pretty poor there, isn't it, by the looks of things? Or is that wrong?
It is, but then again, I think there are one or two things to bring in here. We hear on the media about, Russia having 190,000 people in Ukraine. True to an extent, but in fact, what you might call the military controlled by Russia, probably down to about 140, 145,000. Now, if you've lost 15,000 of those and another 30,000, quote, off the battlefield, that is a huge proportion. And many of the early groups that were actually involved in the fighting right at the start took huge losses, and they are having to be restructured. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right, Owen, that they're bringing more forces into the east, but many of those are where one of their sort of tactical regiment groups or battalion groups would have to be actually mixed up with another one to produce something which is at the right strength. Now, the effect on morale of young Russians in the armed forces is considerable. So to put it bluntly, I hate to use these terms in a war context, but bluntly, what you might call the perceived quality of the people in these units is low in purely fighting terms. I hate using this terminology. I know, coming from a peace studies department, it doesn't make very much sense, but that's the reality. And essentially, the troops that they have in the East are mostly people who've experienced many problems already. Now, fair enough, they brought them all under one general who actually had a lot of experience in Syria, which may change things. They're trying to constrain their supply lines and the rest. And the Ukrainians have suffered pretty severe losses as well. But the reality is, as things stand at the moment, the Russians are not in a position to even achieve the lesser aims that they've now actually adopted. Now, there are many other things they can do. They do have supplies of cruise and middle-range ballistic missiles, so they can send they can do occasional attacks on, say, armed centers near Kyiv or not so much Mariupol or Odessa and the rest, as they've done. But these are not substantial attacks in terms of taking territory. They are, if you like, more scare tactics. But meanwhile, on the other side, as we've seen, many people within NATO, and I have to say primarily politicians and senior civil servants rather than military, are frankly upping the ante. And they're now talking about complete defeat for Russia. Now, the one thing you'd be absolutely sure of, you cannot completely defeat Russia in these circumstances because it is one of the two most advanced worldwide nuclear powers. And we have to face up to that, which is what produces a huge difficulty in trying to chart a way towards some kind of settlement, I'm afraid.
Is this now a proxy war between the West and Russia in Ukraine?
Increasingly. I mean, essentially, if you're trying to characterize wars of the modern era, you get some which are state on state, purely and simply. You would say that would be true of the Falklands-Malvinas conflict 40 years ago. Others are much more proxy wars, and there have been many examples of those in recent years, where the proxies have basically been aided hugely, bluntly, either by the West or by the East in the old Cold War days, and in rather more complicated ways since. Now we actually have a mixture of the two, but the slide over the last 9 weeks has been away from state on state with support from abroad to more and more of a proxy war as well. It's still increasing, it's still primarily Ukraine against Russia. And I mean, there've been some pretty cynical comments that in fact NATO will fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. Now that may be pushing it a long way, but in a sense, Ukraine is becoming a vehicle. And if you take the really hawkish elements in the West, and then by no means dominant, but they are there, what you actually see is they see this as the opportunity to cripple Russia for a long time. And those who see the axis of the world turning into either the West or China come Russia, they actually see this doubly advantageous because it will be more embarrassing to the Chinese. Now, that element is not dominant in the West, although I think some politicians, not least in Britain, are seeing it more and more that way. You can say it's absolutely understandable because we must never forget in all of this the appalling behavior time and time again of the Russian troops. And I mean, the other big question is, why isn't the world condemnation from ordinary people even stronger than it is? We can perhaps get onto that. But the reality here is that this is to a large extent a proxy war. And in that respect, I think it is becoming rather more dangerous.
I mean, on that, well, firstly, actually, there's a comment from Tad Cantwell. What does Paul Rogers think of is it Gerasimov?
Gerasimov. Yeah.
Being sent to change the tactics on the Eastern Front. So that, and then that other point you just made about, I suppose for those of us like myself who would regard themselves as ardent critics of Western power, I would still look at this unequivocally and say this is heinous Russian aggression, and Ukraine's fighting a war of self-defense against that. But in much of the global South, including many governments, have declared a position of neutrality. So I'm just interested in why you think that is, as well as I said, this point about Gerasimov.
Well, Tadeusz is quite right. I mean, when I mentioned that a single general is being put in charge, that is Gerasimov, and he is the person who had huge experience in Syria, and a pretty forceful commander, because one of the problems in Ukraine throughout, from the Russian point of view, is basically multiple commands and competition within the commanding groups. And Gerasimov may well make a difference to an extent, but that does not bode well for the future of the war, because he used particularly tough measures when he was in Ukraine. But coming back to your other point, Owen, if I may, this is a very big issue. And I'll probably be rather unpopular for saying some of the things that I say in response. The broad thing, of course, is that a number of countries, including major countries in the global South, have long had close relations with Russia. India, for example, has a very close military relationship. Russia has been pretty assiduous in basically selling arms to a range of countries. And so that at least explains it in part. But it's a wider thing than that. It's not that many people, probably most people across the global South, are not condemning Russia. They are, and you get very strong condemnation. But you also got a very strong mood of plague on both your houses, put it that way. Yes, what is happening in Ukraine is appalling. What the West is seeing on television almost 24/7, particularly in the early days, is the appalling consequences. I mean, we have seen bodies in the streets. We've seen the level of destruction. We've heard what's been going on. And that has had a huge effect on the West, partly because it is within Europe, but also, I think, because it is a level of visualization of war on everyday mainstream television, but we haven't really seen before with this intensity. Now, if you take typical television viewers in, say, the Middle East, who are watching the Arabic version of Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya or the many other channels, in fact, that is the kind of level of the experience of war which they saw in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the more recent war against ISIS and the rest. So they basically see, well, yes, this is terrible, but, well, put it this way, I mean, when Fallujah was under siege by the US Marines in, I think it was November 2004, in response to many atrocities, essentially the city was cleared of the rebels, but in the process, I think every public building was destroyed or badly damaged, and every house was destroyed. Half of all the houses were destroyed or badly damaged. When it came to trying to get rid of ISIS in Mosul, the cost was almost the destruction of the old city of Mosul. And if you track through the accurate reporting, which you've got from some of the really good American foreign correspondents, you see incidents of direct reprisals and things like that. Now, I'm not in any way arguing that it has been at the intensity of what we've seen in Ukraine from many of the Russian military, but it has been there and it's been protracted. And remember, in the war against ISIS, which basically was 2014-18, but still continues to this day, almost unreported in the West, except occasionally, as in Mosul, you actually had, roughly speaking, 100,000 precision-guided bombs and munitions used. You had 30,000 targets hit. On an American estimates, you had at least 60,000 ISIS supporters killed. Now, independent groups like Air Wars actually include in that probably 6,000 or 7,000 civilians killed as well. Now, that's almost unreported in the West. There were no Western journalists there, of course. So in other words, from the rest of the world looks rather different. And I think this goes a long way to explain it. It doesn't in any way condone what the Russians are doing. And many people in the global South are anti that as much as anything. But they just see the world in a perhaps slightly more nuanced way. And it's not all goodies and all baddies, I'm afraid.
Am I here? There I am. The point, Paul, about nuclear escalation. How much of a threat is that? Because these are nuclear armed blocs, both of them. They both have nuclear weapons. we're hearing some, I mean, on the West, which is Russia has to be permanently hobbled, essentially, and the Russian state has not responded well to that. How serious do you think an escalation is, bearing in mind nuclear weapons are possessed by both blocs?
Well, I'll betray a little bit about my age. I do remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a student in London at that time. It was one of the things which actually made me really think about nuclear weapons and become pretty bitterly anti-nuclear, which I have been ever since. The point is that looking over a long-term period, I think the potential for an escalation here was already greater than the Able Archer crisis back in October, November, what was it? 1990. Old age, I've forgotten the date. I'll come back. It doesn't matter. It was basically, it's the same as Greenland, 1983, autumn of 1983. That was a pretty dangerous one. This is already worse. It's not yet at the level of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but could quite easily become one. One has to be careful what one says on air, because, you know, one can unnecessarily cause people real concern. But I'll try and sort of put an analytical mind on it. One thing to remember is that throughout the Cold War, both NATO and Russia and the Soviet Union, as it then was, had loads of nuclear weapons, including many battlefield nuclear weapons. NATO's policy at the time, from when was it, 1968, I think, MC 14.3, the communicator that came out, was to go for flexible response, which meant that if NATO was losing a conventional war against the Soviet Union, against the Soviet bloc, they would have recourse to tactical nuclear weapons early on in the day in the battlefield context. I remember getting this firsthand when I was in on a briefing in NATO back in the mid-1980s, speaking over coffee with a senior German civil servant in the nuclear planning group. And I asked him, well, what would NATO do then if they were faced with a sudden huge impact of the Soviets crossing the border into West Germany? He said, well, one of the possibilities would be 5 low-yield airburst nuclear weapons, causing very little damage or death, but showing the Russians that we meant business. And that was basically written into it. Now we assume, whatever the propaganda from the Soviet Union, they thought exactly the same. Now it so happens, of course, that the NATO policy is still the modern policy, technically, although NATO is so powerful conventionally that nobody would think of that. But it is the policy, and there have been several cases with Britain, for example, British military or politicians warning of the possible use of nuclear weapons in both the first and second Iraq wars. And of course, we did actually transport tactical nuclear weapons for the Falklands War, the Falklands-Malvinas War. So it's built in. The change recently in Russia is simply that in the 1990s, they still had the nuclear weapons, but the conventional weapons were really becoming appallingly backward and limited. And so what happened was an increasing Russian move towards a willingness to basically, it was built into their thinking to go to a small-scale tactical nuclear use at an early stage. That's the circumstances we're in. Now, Russia is not being defeated in terms of Russia itself, but it's becoming more and more dangerous in terms of the rhetoric being used. So I think this is the one area where we really need caution. I'm afraid politicians who basically talk about getting the Russians completely out of Ukraine, there is no other way forward. I think that's dangerous talk, and I wish they wouldn't say it.
Just finally, partly because my Wi-Fi can see us playing. David, I know this is way too early, but what happens after the war? Where Ukraine, or does the West only care comes to stopping Russia? What's your take on that in terms of what happens in terms of the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine? Those links out there is, how long do you think this will? Because it's now being spoken about, this could be years and years and years.
I don't think it'll necessarily, I mean, it is in a stalemate, but I think there are problems that Russia is experiencing, serious ones. We simply don't know whether the Chinese will bluntly pull the plug on it at some stage because it's becoming more difficult for them. We simply don't know the impact of those casualties. And basically, to use a very crude term, the impact of the mothers who lost sons in Afghanistan was one of the things that brought that war to a very early end. Now, the losses are even higher in Russia. Although the power base has very strong media control, I rather suspect that given weeks and maybe months more, that will basically be an element which may increase and may even affect Putin. Under those conditions, then diplomacy counts for huge amounts. And this is where you have to bring in the UN effectively. Then it may then be possible to get some sort of compromise. But that, in a way, is in response to David Bywater's question, and that is what happens after that. Well, essentially, if, let's say ideally there was some sort of compromise in which tacitly, in spite of all they've experienced, the Ukrainians accept that they do lose Crimea, and that part of the territory in the east, in the wider Donetsk region, is not under Russian control, but it has a degree of quasi-independence. And I think they would accept that, provided they have sort of border control. And Russia could then say, well, we've improved our position. If that was to happen, then I think, well, for a start, I do not think Ukraine would even then be welcome in NATO. It would certainly get much closer cooperation with the EU. And then the risk is that the West moves on. I think actually that is unlikely, because the impact of this war on Western public thinking is such that that would be very difficult to do. Now, I had to be careful about that, because I mean, Britain has been so appalling in terms of the Ukrainian refugees compared with Poland and Germany and the rest. I'm never quite sure. So bluntly, I think it would depend, as far as British role is, depends very much which party is in power in Britain. I think there might be some difference if it was a Labour government rather than a Conservative government. Although I sometimes wonder, given the state of the Labour Party, but that's a personal view.
Yeah, one I can sympathise with. Paul, that was absolutely brilliant as ever. Again, always a tour de force from you. Really, really brilliant insights, and bleak, depressing, but that's the material we've got, but nonetheless full of realism. So really, really, really appreciate your expertise and for putting up with my collapsing Wi-Fi, which I can see is not doing so well. But honestly, Paul, that was brilliant as ever. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. I wish that one could speak a lot more positively. There are many other things happening. I remember you always remind you of one thing, that is, the world over, most people live in conditions of tolerable peace most of the time. We always have to hold that back when you're dealing with this sort of issue.
Yeah, and I can imagine, I suppose, for you, I remember during the financial crash, well, every time Robert Peston was complained, he only ever appeared when things were going very, very badly in the world. And I suppose it's similar with your line of work, even though, of course, you're a professor of peace studies. But honestly,
I have all these colleagues who work on mediation and peace building, so I'm the outlier in peace status. We're not all like me, believe me.
Well, I wish we had more experts of your caliber, but nonetheless, it's been a huge endeavour. Take care, Paul, and speak to you soon.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant stuff as ever from Paul. Really, really lucky to have him and his expertise. In fact, that was brilliant. So we'll clip his video separately and put it up. Sorry about the Wi-Fi. And my mic also played up. We're getting there. Before I wrap up, just again, I think I mentioned at the beginning, we are interviewing Noam Chomsky. Partly we'll talk about Ukraine and Russia. Judith Butler. Lots to talk about with Judith Butler since we last spoke to her in terms of the issue of the continuing onslaught against trans people in Britain in particular, but not just Britain. And Peter Hitchens, because we need to talk to people across the spectrum, and people always appreciate the interviews I do with him. I have noted. So if you want to put questions to them, you can support us on patreon.com/owenjones84. That keeps this channel going. And we've got some documentaries to come, but again, you're going to decide what we do. That's the idea. But do press like if you're watching on YouTube, and hit the subscribe button, and also listen to us on our podcast. I'm going to leave before my Wi-Fi implodes completely. But again, thanks to our brilliant guests. We've, I think, quite an eclectic range, I would say, we've covered today. But an insight from all our guests. All right, everyone, take care, and I will see you next week. Oh, hold on. Before